What's up, everybody? Ryan Turford here, and today we're talking about PS1 and PS2 classics on the PS3 store. This is another video in the ongoing series of videos going on about my personal 10 recommendations for each console as the PS3 and PSP and PS Vita stores come to a close. Of course, just as always with these lists are just my personal recommendations. Of course, if I missed your favorite game here or a game that you think should have been on this list, definitely let me know in the comments below. Again, nothing against your particular favorite game. Again, this is just my personal list and kind of my personal recommendations. But again, with the PS1 library, which we're talking about today, there's lots of choice, and there's actually a lot of games to choose from. In fact, again, it was hard narrowing down this list, but I did keep a couple factors in mind. Number one, obviously, more expensive and harder to find physical games bump certain games up this ranking. But I wanted to make sure, again, that this list wasn't just going to price sorting by price, and then picking games that way. I wanted to make sure that this list was a list of games that I think not only combine the fact that they're a little bit harder to find, but also are fun today. So let's start with my first pick, Mega Man Legends 1 and 2 and the Misadventures of Tron Bonne. Yes, it's 3 games, and no, there's not a collection to buy them together, but it's $15 to buy all 3 of these games, versus if you want to buy them physically, it's over $1,000 if you want to buy all 3 of them right now, because Misadventures of Tron Bonne on its own is like a $900 game complete if you want a complete copy of that game. So obviously, these Mega Man Legends games, they were third-person action adventure games starring Mega Man. Again, this was kind of during that era where everyone was trying to do 3D platformers or 3D action games, and everyone was trying to chase Mario 64 and Zelda Ocarina of Time. And this was kind of Capcom's attempt at that with Mega Man Legends 1 and 2. I will argue that probably these games don't hold up as well, but if you have any intention of playing these games at all, you should buy them right now while they're still in the store, because again, otherwise it's going to be very, very tough to actually accrue physical copies of these, especially because, again, the price is really high right now for each one of these games. But I anticipate it just shooting through the roof when the store closes. Again, the prices are where they are with the logic that you can still buy these games physically. Like, I think Misadventures of Tron Bonne is going to end up being the Little Samson of this console. And for those that know, Little Samson's one of the most expensive NES titles. It's like, right now, it's tough to get one below 1,500. So I definitely think Tron Bonne is going to be kind of in that stratosphere. So I definitely recommend grabbing these now if you have any intention at all of playing them. I think it's definitely worth a pickup for these. Next up is a 2D platformer that I've actually never really gotten into before. This is actually my first time picking it up. But again, I wanted to recommend it now because, again, it's kind of in the Mega Man Legends camp of super expensive, and I've only heard great things about it. So even though I haven't really played it myself yet, I wanted to make sure that it was on this list, and that is Klonoa Door to Phantomile. So, of course, we have gotten Klonoa on other consoles, including the Wii, but this is the PlayStation game that sort of started it all with the series. And again, I've heard nothing but great things about Klonoa. Again, I've never really played it myself, but I plan on playing it over the summer because I made sure to pick it up now because, again, it's like $5 versus the stupidly expensive physical price for it now. And again, it's a game that it's going to shoot into the stratosphere at some point. So again, it's a game that I know is going to be fun, combined with the fact that it's expensive. So I do think well worth your time and well worth the pickup. Next up, to get away from some of the more expensive games, I wanted to highlight some of the games that aren't super expensive, but I definitely think are worth picking up now. Number one, because I think some of these prices are going to go up. But number two, they're really fun. And I'm going to start with Parasite Eve 1 and 2. Now, of course, if you saw the video talking about the PSP, obviously I love Parasite Eve. I love kind of the mashing together of Resident Evil and it's Final Fantasy. And that's kind of what they did with Parasite Eve. It's an action RPG survival horror game, if you can believe it, especially the first one, which is very much a turn-based action RPG or turn-based RPG. And then the second one's more of like an action RPG and more of a traditional survival horror game. But both games really, really fantastic, especially the first one. I love Parasite Eve 1. Like, I can't believe that game isn't available in the same way that a game like Final Fantasy 7 or Final Fantasy 8 is available on current gen consoles. Like, I think people who missed that who like games like Resident Evil would eat that game up. Like they would totally be all over that game. Parasite Eve 1 and 2, fantastic pickups. Again, if you've never played them before, I highly recommend picking both up, or if anything, definitely pick up the first one, because I definitely think the first one is super good, super underrated. I know a lot of people missed it, and I definitely think it's definitely well worth the playthrough. Speaking of Squaresoft and JRPGs, Xenogears was a game that I heard all about growing up during the PS1 days. I never really had a physical copy of it until it came to the PS3 store, where actually I bought it there a long time ago. Played the heck out of it and loved it. Of course, Xenogears essentially, in a lot of ways, inspired the whole Xeno Saga, Xenoblade series, where it's essentially RPGs with mechs. So basically, you'll have standard turn-based battles, just like Final Fantasy, where you're just attacking and defending like normal with your human characters. But then you have the ability to get into mechs and kind of mix up some of the combat, or you'll just have mech on mech battles that are really epic. It's a fantastic game that still really holds up really well today. Again, it's creeping up in price, and I do think it's definitely going to get up higher in price a lot more once the store goes down. And I do think it's a great pickup on your PlayStation 3. Still holds up really well today. So I definitely recommend Xenogears. Another game that I was actually really surprised held up so well and stood the test of time is Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver. This is part of the long-running Legacy of Kain series, of course, helmed by Amy Hennig, who you might know from the Uncharted games. And Legacy of Kain, again, in Soul Reaver, you play as Azrael, and he's basically got this big sword hand, and he goes around and kills stuff. It's super cool. Again, it's a third-person action adventure game, and it has like a great level of exploration going on with it. And I love kind of the environmental storytelling that goes on in that game. And it's just got a great story overall that, again, still really holds up today. So it's definitely well worth a look. Again, it's probably the on the cheaper side of games on this list, but it's definitely a game I highly recommend you check out. Next up, kind of circling back around to some of the more expensive games that are really fun and definitely worth checking out now. Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. Now, again, I mentioned this on the PSP video when talking about Persona there, but Persona 2 Eternal Punishment is essentially the sequel to Persona 2 Innocent Sin, which is weird because, again, we didn't get Innocent Sin, the original, in North America. We got the sequel instead, and then when they did the PSP versions, we got the original, but not the sequel. So obviously, again, if you're going to be picking up Persona 2 on PSP, you're going to want to grab this one as well. Number one, because physical copies of this are stupidly expensive, but number two, you can play it on your PSP after you finish Persona 2 Innocent Sin on PSP. So I love that you have the ability to do both of those on one console, and definitely grab this one while you still can, especially, again, if you're a Persona fan and you want to go back and play sort of the origins of the series. Again, this game plays very differently from modern Persona games. It wasn't really until Persona 3 where they gave us the mold for the current Persona games. But I definitely think that it's important for Persona fans to check a game like this out at some point, especially if you want to know more about kind of the series origins. And I think the story in this game is great with some fantastic characters as well. So I definitely think it's worth checking out just for that. Now, the next game is a game I totally had missed when the PlayStation 1 came out. Again, I saw it on shelves all the time. I was like, what is this Suikoden game, or Suikoden, or however you say it? Again, I know how to say it now. That's just past Ryan. That's how past Ryan was thinking when he saw this game in EB Games all the time for like clearance, and no one could get rid of it. And now the game's stupidly expensive because Suikoden 2, of course, is kind of a cult classic game, a game that, again, not a lot of people really checked out on the PlayStation 1, but it's a fantastic turn-based JRPG from Konami. Again, I don't really love the first Suikoden game, but I do really love Suikoden 2. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's almost like Game of Thrones JRPG thing. It's kind of takes all the JRPG tropes and throws them out the window and then tries its own thing, which I think is really cool. Again, it was definitely would have been refreshing at the time if you played it back then. But it's cool to see now a PlayStation 1 game that definitely goes along the lines of trying to do something unique. So I definitely recommend Suikoden 2. I think it's super fun and definitely well worth the pickup. One of my favorite all-time series, of course, Castlevania. Again, we've had a Castlevania game on the PSP video, and now we've got one on this video. Castlevania Chronicles, of course. Castlevania Chronicles is more 2D Castlevania action, which again is my favorite way to play Castlevania. I mean, to be fair, I don't know how many people will actually tell you the 3D games are their favorite, but obviously I know those people are out there, so there's nothing wrong with that. But Castlevania Chronicles, really fun game that, again, I usually never see physical copies of anywhere, but I know it's not like a stupidly expensive game either, but I know that it's fun. I played a lot of it, especially like I'd pick this up as soon as I saw it come to the store in the first place, played a ton of it on PS3, and it's a game that I think you definitely want to grab now while you still can, because I think it's going to definitely be harder to find for sure. Another game that, again, not stupidly expensive now, but I think is probably going to rise in price and is definitely worth checking out, Dino Crisis 1 and 2. This is essentially Resident Evil with dinosaurs. So that's essentially the pitch. It's made by Capcom. You basically run around and, you know, try not to get eaten by Tyrannosauruses. That's essentially what you do here. I actually really liked these games. Again, I don't think they hold up super well because of tank controls, obviously. Again, it's definitely harder to go back to those or even the classic Resident Evil games now. But at the same time, if you've never played them, I think you're going to want to grab them now, again, before they disappear from the store. Because again, I think those physical copies are going to probably shoot up in price and they're going to be definitely harder to find, especially Dino Crisis 2, which has been creeping up in price for a while now. So definitely highly recommend Dino Crisis 1 and 2. I think they're super fun. And last but not least on the list, sticking with horror games, and you know, we couldn't do a PlayStation 1 list without talking about Silent Hill, the original, the OG Silent Hill. Of course, one of my all-time favorite horror franchises. I love Silent Hill 2 in particular. That's my favorite game in the series. Silent Hill 1, though, is no slouch, though. It's actually really fun. Again, I don't think it holds up as well as the PS2 iterations, but I do think it's still really fun to play today. And again, the price on Silent Hill already right now is very, very expensive. So and it's probably going to definitely climb after it departs the store. So I definitely think this is the way you're going to want to pick this up now while you still can, especially if you, again, are a Silent Hill fan or even just a modern day Resident Evil fan and you want to check out some older horror games. I definitely recommend checking out Silent Hill. It's still really creepy and atmospheric. It doesn't have tank control problems, but it does have kind of a weird camera, so it doesn't hold up super well, but I definitely think it is well worth playing and picking up. Now, next, we're going to shift gears to the PlayStation 2. Now, folks might not remember that PlayStation 2 actually got a pretty sizable library on PS3. We do have some PlayStation classics on PS4, and I made sure that for this list, I didn't pull any from there. We don't really have any of the expensive PS2 games on there. There is a couple in here that I'm going to highlight, but for the most part, most of these games are actually fairly common. Again, you're still going to probably see them go up in price after the store closure. I mean, they're not going to be unaffected by this, but I definitely think these are 10 games that you should check out now, especially that way you don't have to hunt down a physical copy for them. And in most cases, these are actually cheaper than their physical counterparts. So I'm going to start with Fatal Frame 1 through 3. These are Japanese horror games, very similar stylistically to something like The Ring, where essentially you're going around and capturing ghosts with a camera. A camera that if you take a picture of a ghost, it kills the ghost. I don't know how it works. It's a magic camera, okay? Don't ask me to explain it. Now, I know these games actually got reprinted back in the day because Tecmo did a giant batch of reprints for these. But at the same time, I think that they're worth grabbing now because, again, I think the supply of those games, even with the reprints, aren't going to last forever. And I think they're going to creep up in price at some point. So I do recommend picking them up now. Plus, they still hold up really well. Again, they're first-person games where you're holding the camera, essentially. So it's not a Resident Evil situation where you're having to deal with tank controls or anything like that. Still really fun games to play today. Still very creepy. So if you like creepy horror games, I think you're going to really dig Fatal Frame, especially if you've never played these games before. So definitely check these out on PlayStation 3. Next up is actually kind of a weird one because you can pick this up as part of Odin Sphere Lifewiser, which is on PlayStation 4, but it's the original Odin Sphere. It's $10, Canadian anyways, on the PlayStation Store. Really fun side-scrolling action RPG from our friends over at Vanillaware, who make incredible looking games. This was one of the last releases on the PlayStation 2, and it looks absolutely gorgeous. It's still on PlayStation 2 today, and it's still well worth looking at. Obviously, though, if you already own Odin Sphere on PlayStation 4, the remake of that, probably not going to be up your alley. But I do think that if you want to play the PS2 original, definitely much cheaper to go this route than to actually hunt down a physical copy of it. So that's kind of why I wanted to have Odin Sphere on here. Not only that, but it's a game that I actually really love. I think it's fantastic, and just not enough people have played it. So I highly recommend checking out either here or again, if picking up the PlayStation 4 version if you want to go that route. Two games that are near and dear to my heart as a big Persona fan, Persona 3 FES and Persona 4, the original version. So obviously, many of you have probably played Persona 4 Golden already, but if you wanted to ever check out the original version of Persona 4, yes, I know, obviously it's missing the new content from Persona 4 Golden, but it's cool to go back and revisit it. Visit sometimes original versions of games, especially because it does have some different cinematics and other story elements to it. So it's definitely worth a pickup, but more so Persona 3 FES, which I think is kind of the definitive version of Persona 3. If you've never played Persona 3 before, I think that's the version that I recommend that you start with and play first. And again, there's a bunch of versions to choose from, whether you play original Persona 3 or FES or portable. I think FES on PlayStation 3, probably your best bet to check out those games. And again, these two games aren't super rare, but again, Persona fans, you're going to want to grab these, whether you grab them physically or on the story, especially FES, which I think that it's definitely the best way to play that game. Sticking in the world with Shin Megami Tensei, we have Shin Megami Tensei Digital Devil Saga 1 and 2. These are very different from Persona, but they also have a lot of similarities to Persona in as far as the combat feels pretty similar. Exploration feels kind of like Persona 3, where you're running around different palaces. And it's just really interesting to see kind of the contrast between the kind of mainline Shin Megami Tensei games and Persona 3 and 4. You can also get Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne on the store as well, but that is getting a re-release fairly soon. So I would say maybe wait till the re-release comes out first. And if the re-release doesn't play well, you've got Nocturne on the store as well, which is great because, again, it's a really cheap to pick that up there. But Digital Devil Saga 1, I played a lot on PS2, loved it, and I never really checked out the second one. I heard really good things about it, though. It's on my PS3. I've just never gotten time to actually play it yet. But I definitely think you're going to want to grab these games now. Again, they're going to be harder to find physically probably after the store closure, even though they're not super expensive now. I definitely think it's worth taking a look at these games, whether you're going to grab them now physically or on the store. Next up, of course, I love horror games. I've talked about it a whole bunch on this list. Siren is actually a really interesting Japanese horror game. Again, kind of similar to Fatal Frame, where it's very much inspired by Japanese horror films. It's kind of out there. So obviously if you like weird games, I think you're probably going to want to check this one out. Again, especially weird Japanese horror games. I think you're really like it. Again, Siren actually got a sequel on PlayStation 3 in the form of like a digital episodic based game, essentially. But I think Siren, the original, really cool underrated horror gem on the PlayStation 2. And again, it's cool to have it on the PlayStation 3 store and ready to pick up there, because I think that's a great way to play that. Next up, we got Stella Deus, The Gate of Eternity. This is a turn-based Japanese role-playing game. This one's actually one of the most expensive games on my PS2 list. And it's one of the reasons why I actually wanted to make sure I talked about PS2 games on this video, because Stella Deus, actually, I've never played it, but looks really fun. And I wanted to make sure to include it here because, again, creeping up in price. It's over $100 now for a physical copy. So I definitely think it's well worth picking up, because I picked up the PS3 version. I just haven't gotten to it yet. But it looks like a fantastic JRPG. Yes, it got kind of a middling reviews when it came out. But I think in the lens of 21, I think it'll be pretty fun to go back and play that. Next up, back to the world of horror, we've got Trapt. Now, Trapt, of course, very different horror game because it's very much a non-combat horror game. It kind of reminds me a lot of Clock Tower, where essentially you're kind of running away from something that's trying to kill you, but you have the ability to kind of set traps. That's kind of why it's called Trapt. It's not based off the band Trapt that did Headstrong, but it's actually like all about, setting traps for the thing that's chasing you and kind of like using the time to that's bought by the traps to kind of get away from it. So I think this is actually a really cool horror game. Again, there are some elements of it that don't hold up super well, but I do think it's really fun and definitely, again, a great way to play it. It's definitely cheaper to buy it digitally than physically, so one that I recommend checking out. Next up, another game that's pretty expensive, but is also super fun. Capcom vs SNK 2, Mark of the Millennium. In a lot of ways, Capcom vs SNK 2 was kind of Smash Brothers before Smash Brothers, even though, again, I realized this came out after Super Smash Brothers came out, but where it was essentially two big IPs from two different companies coming together and forming a fighting game. Of course, we'd already had Marvel vs. Capcom before this, but this game combined the King of Fighters from SNK, fighting against the standard Capcom Street Fighter fighters, which again was just super cool to see on PlayStation 2. So it's a great fighting game, still holds up really well, and I think it's a great pickup on the store now if you missed it back in the day. And again, one creeping up in price for sure physically, so it's one that you're going to want to keep your eyes on. Next up is a game that I actually talked about on a recent episode of The Crossroads on the Xbox Drive, our Xbox podcast. And The Crossroads, of course, is our show that's all about the original Xbox. Psychonauts. Psychonauts, great game from Tim Schafer. It's a 3D action platforming game with some fantastic humor. It's all about going to the summer camp that's training psychic soldiers. And you enter people's brains, and the brains are all really unique from each other and different. And it's kind of reflects the thoughts of the person whose brain you're going into. Really, really wacky and goofy game that, again, I know a lot of people really missed when it first launched. It didn't really sell well, which is part of the reason why Double Fine, the studio that made this, kind of shifted to smaller releases. And not only that, but Psychonauts actually has a sequel coming out pretty soon on PlayStation 4. So I think that if you want to check out Psychonauts 2, you should definitely play the original Psychonauts. It's still fantastic. It still holds up really well. And again, playing on PlayStation 3, I think is great. So I highly recommend checking out Psychonauts. And the last two games are two games that I've installed already, haven't checked out, but I wanted to give them the final shout out on this list because they are the most expensive games by far on this list. And that is Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoner 1 and 2. Again, they've got giant long names, so I'm not going to recite them here. But essentially, they're third-person action games where essentially you will summon creatures from the Shin Megami Tensei universe and have them battle other creatures while you also attack them in real-time battles. It has a story to it as well, but it's not really like an open world RPG or anything like that. And it's very different from games like Digital Devil Saga or Persona. It's very much more about kind of experiencing the story in either visual novel or cinematic form, and then going into battles and kind of going back and forth between those two. So really interesting looking games. Again, I picked them up now because, again, they are like over $200 if you want to buy them physically now. So you definitely, if you're at all interested in these games now, definitely pick them up now. I'm interested to play them though, because I haven't played them, but I wanted to give them this final shout out because, again, they are very expensive. And again, knowing the Shin Megami seal of quality that comes along with these games, I know they're probably going to be good games to play. And there you go. That was my list of PS1 and PS2 games on the PSN store that I recommend picking up before the shuts down. But of course, what do you think? What are your suggestions? What games did I miss? Let me know in the comments below. Again, the PS2 list was actually a little bit easier to put together because there isn't actually a huge library of PS2 games out right now, especially considering some of the ones that are cross-platform like Code Veronica, Grand Theft Auto. Again, I didn't talk about those because you can still buy those after the store closure. But I do think I compiled a pretty good list here. And then the PS1 list, again, it could have been like 20 or 30 games because there are so many great PS1 classics on the store right now that I think are still worth picking up. It could almost warrant a second video at this point. So I'm bound to have missed some. So let me know in the comments below what y'all think. Of course, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You can also find us on the Xbox Drive over at youtube.com/the Xbox Drive or on podcast services around the globe. So for now, I'm Ryan Turford. Thanks you so much for checking out my PS3, PS1, and PS2 video, and I'm out.